Today, we're really honored to have Jim Sullivan with us today. I know it's warm where he's living right now, right, Jim? What's the temperature up
Well,
there?
I'm looking at snow out my window. It's flaking down on us now.
He lives in Maine. One of the benefits of Zoom presentations is we can get access to some people, certainly with his author credentials and background. His book was reviewed on the Wall Street Journal. I'd actually seen it before that, but was really happy to see the review they gave it. It's an extraordinary write-up about a kind of a unique situation. So I'm going to let him give us some background and kind of how he came upon this story and the story itself. So Jim, you can take it away. We're going to see if your computer works. If it doesn't, Carl's going to show your slides.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think, let me just try to.
Okay, here we go.
All right, very good. Well, good. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to speak today about the book, Unsinkable. It's been on my mind a lot the last 4 years. And before I get underway talking about it, I'll just tell you about a couple local Colorado connections to this one. One of the chapters in the book, in fact, is entitled Thornton, Colorado, because one of the 5 men at the heart of this story was one of the ship's officers, one of the Plunkett's officers. About 5 or 6 years ago, he relocated to Colorado from La Jolla, where he'd lived. He was in his 90s. He had family in the area. And on a couple of occasions during the writing of the book, I came out to spend a couple of long weekends with Ken Brown and his family. And the other connection that I've got is that the last trip my family took before the pandemic hit, well, the summer before, 2 summers ago, was we flew to Denver and then went up to Rocky Mountain National Park. And I think I still remember we were camping, and the greatest cup of coffee I think I've ever had in my life was the cup I had sitting outside the tent in the morning looking up at Long's Peak, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. So those are my 2 Colorado connections here. So anyway, I'll get underway now on the story of this book. I thought I'd talk a little bit about how the book came together, and about what a couple of the takeaways were for me as a writer in the 4-year journey that was this book. And this title, Pulling Thread to Cable, the inadvertent resurfacing of the USS Plunkett, I started work on this book without realizing that I was starting work on a book. I had pulled this one thread, and every time I pulled something, it became more substantial. The thread became rope, the rope became cable, and pretty soon I realized that I had something really, really profound at the end of my line. The story really begins when I was a kid growing up in the 1970s, just outside Boston, Massachusetts. If you go to that next slide, you can see one of these cookouts that we used to have until I was about 13 years old. My family lived all very close together. My family was all from South Boston and Dorchester. And shortly before I was born, this picture was taken in 1966. They'd moved a few miles outside the city into the suburbs, but they all still clung to each other and lived together, lived close by. And like many of us at that time, I don't think that I've ever been able to look over my shoulder, or I don't think any of us can really look over our shoulders and not see someone who had been involved in the war in a significant way, whether it be a mother who worked in a shipyard or a factory, or a father who was on the front lines, or a great uncle or a great aunt, a grandfather. They were a dime a dozen up and down the street when I was a kid, around the corner. In this picture here, the man at the lower left is my great uncle Warren Meehan, who was a sailor in the Pacific, and whose mother saw him. He was actually pictured in a photograph during the war under aerial assault on a Navy ship. And his mother was a good friend of the Speaker of the House at the time, John McCormick, and she saw to it that her son was relocated off that ship. He never forgave her for pulling him that way. At the back of the photo, there's right behind the umbrella, that's my great uncle Billy Lydon, who was on a tank that went into Bastogne. So, you know, at any one of these family gatherings, for me, and I think probably for all of you, you know, we've got these people who were connected to this epic of an ordeal that occurred in the midst of the 20th century. When I think about those times, I often thought about this one man who was never at any of these family events. And I had no idea that 40 years after these events, I'd go looking for him. And it was all kind of accidental. And it begins with the story that one of these men told. And you can see on the next slide where that story began. These are two of my grandfather's brothers. There were 5 Gallaghers, and they grew up in Dorchester, Massachusetts, which is a neighborhood of Boston. 4 of the 5 brothers went away to war. They wanted one of them to stay home because their mother was a widow. Their father had died of tuberculosis in 1924. And one of their brothers, my grandfather, was already married and had a couple of children. And they decided that they and the local draft board decided that Charlie Gallagher was not going to go. John Gallagher, who's on the right here, he was up at Hemingway Park in Dorchester when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and went straight to the pub after he found out. And he and his friends, 2 of them, George Hurley and Franny Driscoll, that night at midnight went down to the post office in Boston and enlisted in the Navy. So he was right from the get-go ready to go. Frank was drafted a couple of months later. Frank was already close to 30 years old at the time. So he went into the Army. 2 of the other Gallagher brothers also were pulled into the Army. But when I was a kid in the 70s, Frank used to tell this story. And in fact, he told this story from the 40s all the way up until 2012 when he died at the age of 98. It was the most famous story in my family, probably the most famous story across all the branches of my family. And it had to do with this reunion that Frank had with his brother John. This picture that you're looking at here is the first of 2 reunions they had during the war. John was on a US Navy destroyer, the Plunkett, and they had come in to the port of Mers El Kaber in North Africa, which is near Oran in present-day Algeria. And he had found out that the 5th Army and his brother's infantry unit was over the hill getting ready for the invasion of the Italian mainland at Salerno. So he got a pass and he jumped into an Army transport and went over the hill and found his brother and had this picture taken, this reunion picture. But this isn't the story that Frank used to tell about all the time. He told the story about the 2nd reunion. It was January of 1944. They had been into Salerno now, and the Allies are fighting up the Italian boot, trying to get into Rome, but they can't because the Germans have the high ground at the Gustav line with big guns on Monte Cassino, and they could not get up these valleys. So Winston Churchill, who was ever the man for micro military management, he decided that he was going to inspire an amphibious landing among the military command, and he did. And so they were on the verge of this invasion that was going to do an end run around Cassino and come ashore at Anzio, which is famous for where Nero was when Rome was burning. He was fiddling and Rome was burning. So that was Anzio's first fame. And this is where the invasion was to take place. So Frank, knowing that he's going in, he had gone in at Salerno, and he had gone in on a beach that was so hot, he said that the German Panzer tanks were right down in the sand with us. And he realized that if he could, he wanted to see his brother one more time. So Frank is in a staging area getting ready. They don't know when they're going to be pulled and go board the boats to go up to Anzio. But he finds his way down to the port in Naples, and he approaches what he always called as the admiral's ship, which was tied up at the pier. And he asked if his brother's destroyer was in the area, the USS Plunkett. And he was told that it was out there. They couldn't give him any specific information, but he had enough to take another step. So what he did was he jumped into a little rowboat, a wooden boat manned or helmed by a local boatman, and he had the man row him out among these harbored out Navy vessels that were massing for this invasion. And he's looking for a destroyer. He's looking for the telltale profile, the two stacks, and it's a destroyer is about as long as a football field in most of its end zones. It had two stacks and 4 guns. He knew what the Plunkett looked like, and he identified it by its hull number, 431. And so Frank had this boatman just row him up to the fantail of the ship, and he just climbed up onto the fantail. He had a 5-gallon jerry can half filled with Italian red wine, which may have inspired this trip, because Frank, I think he always said he had been hauling off that can all morning long, and he might have been a little bit glorious with the wine as he climbed up aboard. But he gets up there on board the ship, and he begins to, they grabbed him right away, the sentries, and it was his arrival on the ship was coincidental with general quarters at dawn or dusk. And so the whole ship is turned out now, and they run and get the captain up on the bridge, and the captain comes down. The captain is Eddie Burke, and he's 36 years old, from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, All-American football player at the Academy, and a light heavyweight boxer who lost a national title. So not a man to be trifled with. And you don't climb up on Eddie Burke's destroyer without observing Navy protocol. So he's blasting Frank on the fantail. And all of the sailors now are looking at this scene that's under development on their fantail. And one of the men, who was a gunner on one of the ship's 6 20-millimeter guns, he is in the gun tub, and he's looking at this scene taking place, and he realizes that it's his brother. And so he jumps out and he runs up and he identifies the man as his brother. And Captain Burke decides that he's going to let Frank have his reunion. So they went down below decks, and they played cards and did what they could until there was a red alert, and they had to get Frank off the boat because the invasion was underway. So that's the story that Frank told his whole life. This last reunion with his brother John. He told it so often that each of us in the family, you could have sat us down before one of Ken Burns's documentary cameras, and we could have told his story as he did. And so that's where this whole story began. I had no plans to write a book about this. I had written one book years ago before my children required as much attention as they did when they became 4 or 5 years old. Now it's 2016, and we're planning a trip to Italy, and we had thought about taking a trip to Pompeii from Rome, a day trip, but it was so far to do in one day. Logistically, we couldn't handle it. But my kids were teenagers, and they knew there were beaches near Rome, and pretty soon the idea of going to Anzio surfaced, and I was all for it, because Frank, after he went ashore at Anzio, he was on that beachhead for months because the Allies could not break out, and they were being pummeled by German railway guns. And finally, they busted out and got Rome, but they were 4 months stuck on that beachhead. So Frank talked a lot about Anzio. So I thought, well, we should get to Anzio, because a very dramatic story took place there with my family. So when I decided that we were going to do that, I began to wonder, were any of the men still alive who had been on the ship at the time that Plunkett went into Anzio? And so I started calling around. In the next slide, we'll introduce one of the 5 men at the heart of this book. One of the men is John Gallagher, and the other man is a man named Jim Feltz. And I had found on the internet a website for the last reunion that the Plunkett had had in 2011. And there was a website contact there. A man named Ted Mueller lived in Indiana, had once been the mayor of his small town. There's a phone number, and I called it, and I got to Ted Mueller, and I asked him if there were any men still around who'd been on the Plunkett at Anzio. Ted had come on after Anzio, had been on the ship when it went into Omaha Beach at D-Day, but he said, well, there's this one fella that's real nice, and he was on the ship at Anzio, and I think he'll talk to you. So he gave me both of his phone numbers, his home phone and his cell phone, and so I called him at home, and there was no answer. So I called him on his cell phone, and I got him at a home show, which I thought was just great. This man was 92 years old, and he's at a home show, and I'm thinking, what's he doing at a home show? 92 years old. Is he shopping tile for a new kitchen backsplash? This is a man who's not giving up. And so we started talking on the phone because he picked up, and I can hear, in the background, he's clearly at this big event, but he knows I'm interested in the Plunkett, and this is his ship, and he starts to talk to me about the Plunkett. And then there's just too much noise there. And after about 5 minutes, he says, would you give me a call back at my home tomorrow? I'd love to talk to you. And I said I would. And before I let him go, I told him what my great uncle's name was. I just said my great uncle was on the ship. That's really why I'm interested in this. His name was John J. Gallagher. And when I said his name, there's silence on the other end of the phone. And I know that he's rummaging through his memory. And he's, because there were 265 men on a destroyer. And he doesn't want to disappoint me. And the silence goes on, and I look at my phone because I think the calls drop, but I can hear the chatter. And then his voice comes back to me. And in his voice, there's a smile as big as the moon, because he says, Johnny Gallagher was a very good buddy of mine. And so I about dropped my phone at that point. And Jim later told me that he did too, when he heard the name of the man that they had not only been good buddies, but they were both water tenders. They worked in the ship's fire rooms, and Jim's bunk was right underneath John's bunk for a year and a half. So when I heard that I had just inadvertently bumped into one of my great uncle's best friends, I suspected that there was something more to do with this story than merely satisfy this curiosity that I had when I thought, was anybody still around when the Plunkett started steaming? So I began to make phone calls. The next slide is a picture of another man. I had I'm cognizant of the clock now, and in fact I'm cognizant of the clock. I know I only have a half hour here. I could go on for 2 hours, so I'll try to wrap it up in short order here. But I'm on the phone now because I've got a list of all of the men who were at the last reunion of the Plunkett. And there was this one man, Ken Brown, who had been the ship's gunnery officer. And in 2011, he was still living. And I went up online and I found an obituary for Ken Brown, which is what I was finding most, because it's now 2016. And the youngest of these men are 92, 93 years old. But I found a phone number for a Ken Brown, and I dialed it. There was I found the obituary, and there was a reference to a daughter with a name, Karen Fratantaro in California. And so I found her phone number and I left a voicemail. And the next day, I got a call back from her, and she said, "Hi, my name is Karen Brown, and it just so happens I'm with my father right now." At that time, Ken was 95 years old, on the verge of 96, and still in command of all of the stories that he had. So I kept pulling that thread, and the next slide gets us to Jack Simpson, who was another one of the ship's officers. He was, in fact, a roommate, Ken's first roommate on the plunket. Jack had come aboard right after Pearl Harbor. He was in Pearl Harbor waiting for the plunket to get back after convoy. And Ken came onto the plunket about a month later, and they were in the same room and had this undying respect and affection for each other, though they had lost touch. They'd never lost grip after all these years. So now I have these three men in the memory of my great uncle. And I've bumped into some information about the man pictured in the next slide. I referenced him before. This is Ed Burke. He was an all-American football player, one of just a handful that have come out of the U.S. Naval Academy. And this is Eddie Burke at Soldier Field in 1928. And there are 110,000 people at this game. It was the largest sporting event. He was the captain of Navy's team. And they're going up against Knute Rockne's Ramblers. Although I'm not sure this picture is of the Ramblers, who became the Fighting Irish. But that's Eddie Burke. So now I've got these five really compelling characters. And I've got this ship. I think the ship is on the next slide. This is a U.S. Navy destroyer, DD-431, the USS Plunkett. The Plunkett's job was to do everything pretty much during the war. They went after submarines with their sonar. They went after planes, bombers with their 5-inch guns. You can see two of the 5-inch guns at the front of the ship. And they had a 40 millimeter gun. They would engage in surface combat with E-boats, which are like PT boats. So that was their job, 265 men. I found the 5 men. I found this ship. And the more I pulled these threads, I ran into a story that was so incredible and so filled with sorrow, and that was so devastating, more devastating than anything we had ever suspected in my family. I thought, well, now is the time to really dig deep and see if I could take that thing that was just a legend in my family and embellish it with facts. And what we get as a result is unsinkable. So this next picture, the Plunkett was an interesting ship because it was the only ship of the U.S. Navy to be involved in all 6 invasions in North Africa and the European theater. There was in Europe, there were 5 invasions. There was Sicily, there was Salerno, there was Anzio. Those were the 3 in Italy, and then there were 2 in France. When we think about the invasions, in fact, these days when we think about the Second World War in Europe, we think it begins with Omaha Beach. Well, there was a lot of fighting, of course, in North Africa and Italy before that. The Plunkett was in on the invasion at Omaha Beach. In fact, they carried the film director, John Ford, into Omaha Beach. And it's a really interesting story about that. You know, John Ford, he did all those John Wayne movies, How Green Was My Valley. Well, he had made a documentary about the Navy at Midway, the Battle of Midway, and now he's going into Omaha Beach. And the Plunkett, as they went into Omaha Beach, was at the rear of this line. They were escorting the landing craft, and somehow things got turned around and Plunkett was at the head of the line. That's the way John Ford tells the story. And they got so close that Ford remembers, and he was interviewed by the American Legion magazine in 1961. That was my source on a lot of this. He said that, I was on the bridge at the Plunkett, on one of the wings of the bridge, and I am looking out at these guys in their landing craft. He said what he remembered, he remembered the sound of the men vomiting over the sides of their landing craft. I mean, these are these boats that are going up onto the beach at Omaha Beach. And And he said that um, that was what he remembered, that they were in, and he kept trying to get closer with his cameras. I mean, Plunkett is so close at these landings; its hull is about scraping the sand at Omaha Beach, and so John Ford says to the captain, Outerbridge, Burke is now gone after Anzio. He says to the captain, he says, "Can we get any closer?" And the captain says, "Yeah, we can get closer. I can put you in that whaleboat on the davits over there, and we can have you lowered, and you can take your cameras in as close as you like." So that was as close as John Ford got, and the Plunkett got. So there were the 5 invasions in Europe, and there was the one in North Africa, and it was the only ship in the U.S. Navy that had been in on all of these invasions. The Navy's story in World War II is a much bigger story in the Pacific. But what happened in the European theater and in the Mediterranean was remarkable. The Casablanca here, this came out of my family's collection. These guys, Jim McNellis is on the left. My uncle John Gallagher is beside him. The man in the middle is Vic Zakaruski, who was from South Boston. There is on the far right a man named Irv Dutch Gephardt, who kept a journal throughout the war. He wasn't supposed to, but he did. And I connected with his grandson, and who shows up all over the place in his journal, but my great uncle, John Gallagher. There's this French kid. I scraped off the back of the picture to identify the men in the picture. And Casablanca at that time was in French Morocco. It was a colony of France. And all that's written there about that kid is French kid. That's all he wrote on the back of the plane. But behind the French kid is another man. And that man is Jim Phelps, who is still living. Jim Phelps is a man I talked to 2 days ago. He's doing well. He goes out, he puts on his mask, he does his business, and he goes home. And he's waiting for his vaccine like the rest of us. So that's a little bit more of the Plunkett story. It's notable for having been on all 5 of these invasions in Europe. But perhaps the most noteworthy thing about it is that the Plunkett sustained the most harrowing aerial assault by any US Navy ship, by the German Luftwaffe during the entirety of the Second World War. That's where this book, Unsinkable, that's what it builds to, is to these 25 minutes at Anzio when these men did something extraordinary, when these ordinary men stepped up and didn't flinch and took out 2 planes for sure, probably a 3rd, and maybe a 4th. And that's where we're going as we steam through this book at Unsinkable. So I thank you again for the opportunity to tell you a little bit about the story.
Any questions or comments?
Yeah, I actually, I don't have a question. I want to put in a plug for the book. I'm about halfway through it at the moment, Jim. A small piece of background. 15 years later, I served on a Fletcher class destroyer. So a bit more modern than Plunkett, but not that much different, actually. The book, you've all heard Jim talk now. He writes like he talks. The book is really fun to read. I'm having a great time. I'm reliving all sorts of things. It's well worth reading. So if you don't think you'll like it, try it. Enough.
Well, I appreciate that plug. Thank you very much. You know, the book is, you look at the cover and it looks like military history, and there is that in there. But as I said in the beginning, to me, this is much more of as much a family story as it is anything else. It's about each of us. You know, as I said in the beginning, we have these people, when we look back over our shoulder at these people, these ordinary people we knew as ordinary people who did these extraordinary things. And in a way, I felt like a proxy in this book for all of us who have people who were there and did this. And really the story is, I think, reads that way, is the story of that discovery. So.
Jim, probably time for one last question. What's the connection with Herman Wouk?
Herman Wouk. Okay, so Herman Wouk, he wrote those great books, the two great books about the war, The Winds of War and the War on Remembrance. And I read both of them while I was writing Plunkett. And one day I'm sitting out in my backyard, I'm reading The Winds of War, and Pug Henry, who's the naval officer at the heart of the story, he is, this is fiction, the book is fiction, but he goes back to sea after a long time on assignment on shore. And when he goes back to sea, he's on the Plunkett. And I'm reading this, I had no idea. And I about fell out of my seat when he had invoked the Plunkett. That was going to be the destroyer on the Lend-Lease swap that Herman Wouk write about in The Winds of War. And I think it may have been because the Plunkett was, I don't know if I have it here. Popular Science magazine in 1940 showed a picture of, that's a destroyer with the hull number 431, that's Plunkett. And so it may be that Herman Wouk saw that and just decided that he was going to use the Plunkett as the representative of this new class of ships that was steaming into the war. So that's our connection there.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, thank you so much. Your program was really great. And I appreciate you staying on a little bit later for those of us who wanted to hear the rest of the story, so to speak. I think the name of the book someone asked early or asked in the chat is Unsinkable. And we really appreciate you being with us and sharing the story. And I think a lot of us who are avid readers will be picking up the book. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And thank you for sharing. You know, it's been one of my my dreams to write about what I call ordinary heroes who do extraordinary things. And I think you already took that for me. So thank you so much. And what a great story.
Well, good luck with your own project. Thanks very much.
Thanks.